Apex Legends' new Switch port may be the system's most ambitious to date, though with cutbacks that may surprise hardcore fans. Core porting work is handled by Panic Button, a developer with huge pedigree in Switch conversions like Doom Eternal, Wolfenstein, and Rocket League. But here, Apex offers a very different kind of technical challenge. Firstly, because it's a battle royale with a huge open map that Switch must render in its entirety. Secondly, it's based on Source Engine, a first on Nintendo's machine with till now unproven results. And thirdly, Apex relies on networking 60 players in a single game instance, with Switch must also support crossplay with other consoles. It's no small feat, and in terms of visual side-by-sides with consoles and PC, and the drop in frame rate to 30 FPS, Switch is obviously pruned back to make it happen. The big question, do these cutbacks go too far? Is it still enjoyable in this state? And above all, is Switch still competitive with the other platforms it's cross-playing with online? To find out, I'm diving into Kings Canyon with Jumpmaster Alex Battaglia here. How's it going?
The last time I played this and I was Jumpmaster, I made quite a few mistakes, if anyone remembers that episode of DF Let's Play series. But I'm doing well here, Tom, and I'm excited to talk about Apex Legends on the Switch.
Yeah, I mean, a few points before we go into it. A new patch has landed, patch 1.07 as it's listed in the Switch menus. Don't worry, we have covered it. This is what you're seeing in the footage here and all the analysis. It's understood to improve the frame rate in some respects, and we'll get onto that a bit later. And also, in terms of what we're getting, it is on Switch full Season 8 parity with the content of the other versions. The Kings Canyon map translates, as does the Olympus stage. And yes, obviously cross-platform support is enabled by default on Switch, though there's no option for cross-progression. The only other noteworthy thing is that this is a 19GB install compared to a 64GB install on Xbox One X, for example. So, I mean, that would speak for itself, and as we go into the comparisons, the texture downgrades and all the rest of it, I think it's obvious why.
It's pretty interesting, though, to see that this is Source Engine once again. It's the kind of middle generation version of the Source Engine that the team used for Titanfall 2 with some, upgrades, obviously, to handle the larger multiplayer component that we're seeing here in Apex Legends. And it's the first time we've seen this engine at all on the Switch. To point it out, though, this engine did run on the original Xbox One, and it scaled rather okay there. I mean, it dropped res and turned off some graphical features, but it did set a pretty high standard for performance, I would say, both at the beginning of the generation with Titanfall 1 and also with Titanfall 2. So I do actually expect, considering its source, that it can scale down pretty low if the devs wanted to, and I think that bears out with what we're seeing here, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating first attempt at it. 'Cause, I mean, as I say in the intro, there's a lot to Apex that Switch has to nail, like the Battle Royale side. Obviously, with charted territory, we've seen Fortnite on the console already. But it's still, it's a more realistic style game than Fortnite ever intends to be. And 60 players, network play, cross-play, all the rest of it. I think it's, definitely a steep mountain to climb for Panic Button, who, we've praised in the past for having delivered pretty decent ports.
For sure.
Doom Eternal being quite a recent one. A quick side note, obviously, as we go, we'll be covering comparisons. I've chosen the One X version as the best console version, but we're playing it on a Series X. Now, developer Respawn has actually promised there will be proper next-gen support with Series X and PS5. Apparently, 120 FPS is kind of a priority for them, but we'll have to see how that turns up down the line.
Yeah, so what are we looking at here when we look at the specs for Nintendo Switch here? For example, in docked mode, what kind of resolution did you notice while playing the game?
Well, it is 720p, dynamic. The way it works is pretty much as you'd expect. Look at the sky, you get native 720p, or if it's leveling at 30 FPS, I think there are quite a few shots which will be 720p, but it will go down to numbers like 1066 by 600. During that obviously taxing descent as Jumpmaster, you'll see the frame rate isn't too hot, and it will cull the resolution, the native resolution there. This is one of the points that I will say does affect playability in quite an obvious way, and it's unfortunately the case that you're going to be playing online with 1x code. We're looking at 1440p max DRS, but on Series X you're obviously maxing out that number, you're getting 1440p. When you think of competitive play, it's not really all that fair. I mean, you look across big distances and it's turning to mush on the Switch version, and there's really a lot more detail coming at you on the Series X 1X version.
When you're looking across a map, looking for like small little bits of detail to distinguish player characters from the terrain, it is actually a quite large advantage to be playing at a higher resolution. That definitely has to be said.
Yeah, for sure. And quick note, portable play on Switch. It's a big deal, obviously. It is 576p dynamic. So that is still going to drop, but to a lesser degree to 960 by 550. So there is a range from 576 down to 540. But yeah, it seems to be less flexible, at least in my testing. And also, if we're talking comparisons, it's pretty straightforward. It's basically texture filtering quality is dropped, as we see with a lot of games running in portable mode compared to docked play.
I guess the one thing that is a little unfortunate here, I think these resolutions make quite a bit of sense given the portable power that we're looking here on the Nintendo Switch. The only problem is that, at least for portable play, we're looking at a non-native resolution. So it is going to have a little bit of upscaling going on there, kind of further enhancing the blur that you may already getting from the pixel count itself. So I think I've seen this kind of style of play before, Tom. How exactly did you end up capturing the game here?
Well, similar to how we do the Warzone, and I think we did it with PUBG as well. We choose one kind of rival platform, or several, but in this case I've chosen just Series X, and then have both players join in a single cross-play game, and basically have one player die off, and then they spectate the other. What that means is you get one player controlling. I've mixed and matched. Sometimes it's Switch, sometimes it's Series X. In all cases, it means the camera movement is perfectly matched, but the way the world is rendered is obviously going to be wildly different in this case. All this facilitates a really interesting comparison of just how one world appears on one and what's missing on the other. And I think you can spot more than a few changes on Switch already.
Beyond the resolution, I always thought that the texture quality is one of the biggest differences that you can see right off the bat. And it, plays out as well in the game's install size, that 19 gigabytes versus 63 gigabytes on the Xbox One X version being back compat here through Series X. And it definitely shows. And also, oh my goodness, just watching this play out in front of me here, I guess another rather large difference that you can definitely notice is the difference in, I would say, scattered geometry and scattered vegetation. And this kind of brings us into another whole conversation itself, because looking at the Switch footage here playing, you essentially have no scattered vegetation at all on the Switch beyond the larger brush, like trees and bushes. And this is a multiplayer game played in a cross-platform environment. And that means in all those instances where another player character could be lying down or sitting down right in front of you behind some semi-taller grass on an Xbox One console, for example, you as a Switch player would not be seeing this grass at all, obscuring them, and you would actually have a weird competitive advantage visually in such a moment on the Switch. And usually a lot of multiplayer games don't allow you to tweak that setting. For example, I'm pretty sure actually in the PC version of this game, the grass rendering distance is not one of the tweakable parameters in the graphical options, for example.
It would make sense. I mean, we called it a kind of a cardinal sin of cross-play games, Battle Royale style ones especially, and it's one that the likes of Warzone have avoided just because you can go, I mean, in this game, in fairness, you don't have the option to go fully prone. You're not like crawling through the grass where you can be really camouflaged by the foliage, but I think it still affects the game in terms of overall visibility across range. It's just completely, yes, it's so plain on Switch. It just opens the map right up. Obviously, it's not to discount the fact that the resolution is much lower, and that in itself is a big disadvantage on Switch. But a few other notable points here. Obviously, textures, dropped massively. It's, almost soup-like quality on a Switch at this point, barely recognizable. And shadows, of course, take a big hit. But these are all, aesthetic changes. They're not a huge difference to the way it actually plays, where the foliage stuff does. There's other stuff like alpha effects quality is dropped. Smoke and fire will show massive, sawtooth edges when they overlap with geometry. You can see that they're a massively dropped resolution. But again, it doesn't affect gameplay too radically.
I did get a kick, by the way, about the fact that they even also had to remove bullet shells when the guns are being fired, which I definitely remember that being a thing in Counter-Strike 1.0 almost. So it is pretty interesting to see that being called out of a Switch version. I do wonder if it is actually that expensive, or it was just they just wholesale dropped a lot of effects and things just because they wanted to make sure the frame rate was steady at all times, no matter what. But we'll get to that later, obviously, regarding the frame rate.
I mean, it really shows how far they had to go to get this version running, and how many things they had to tap into, how many settings they had to tap into to try and squeeze every frame out at 30 FPS. It's also quite funny to see, there's still occasional bushes here and there that they've just kept in, kind of separately to the regular grass. There's a lot of decorative stuff which has just gone, but the terrain itself, this is crucial. The framework of the Kings Canyon map is the same. It may be a less complex geometry mesh, but it's actually the same overall layout, and obviously that's crucial. The way it's mapped out has to match with the other cross-playing platforms.
So we're hearing a lot about differences here, just talking about the Switch version, but what is exactly actually the same between these versions when we're looking at the consoles here?
Actually, a surprising number of things that are inessential to the way it plays, like reflections. It's not SSR in this game, it's a cube map on the water body surface, but it's still matched with what we've got on the consoles. And stuff like even cloth physics on flags, and even the shadows underneath the cloth physics as they sway above you. It's all there, and impressively just translates.
So I guess then the question is, did this paring back of even things like foliage and shell casings being ejected from guns and massively reduced shadow quality and all these other things, did they bear out in the performance of this 30 FPS target? How well does it actually hold up when you're playing the game?
Well, 3 points to cover in this one. Firstly, your first impression of this won't be that fantastic. When you skydive down with your jump master, you're going to see a drop. I mean, I think that's inevitable. You're seeing the entire map in its entirety, and with that comes a huge GPU hit, and you're going to go down to maybe 24 FPS, possibly hitting the 20 FPS line, and it can be quite a shock, seeing that in tandem with all the pop-in as you fly downwards at quite a high speed.
Yeah, this is rather typical for these type of games, though, where this is the most expensive part of the rendering. And even on PC, I remember when it launched, testing it on a mid-range Core i5-8400 and GTX 1060 at the time, or it was a RX 580 actually. There was definitely drops when you would do that going into the valley. But that's also a part that is arguably less playable than the rest of the game. Like, what happens when you hit the floor, let's say in docked mode here, and just run around grabbing weapons and, maybe engaging in some light combat? What is that exactly like?
So I guess we're talking about the scavenging phase, where there's not much going on in this point, and you just pick up your weapons. But yeah, as you can see, it's pretty much a locked 30 throughout this whole bit. I've gone through a multitude of games, and again, this is all patch 1.07, so latest update, and it's been really solid. Let's say 95% of the time, where that last 5% is the actual confrontations, finding another squad or anything like that. So it must be stressed that as far as traveling Kings Canyon or the Olympus map goes, you're actually getting a really good turnout so long as you're uncontested.
Yes.
But yeah, once you find another squad, that's where things start to take a turn.
So how low does it end up dropping there usually when you say engage with another 2 to 3 man squad. What is that like?
It can go down to 20 FPS. Pretty full on sometimes, depending on what you've just thrown at them. Obviously, you've got your special abilities, and all these other projectiles which produce alpha effects, which Switch won't be all too happy with rendering. But yeah, this can really, really buckle, pretty much without exception, I'd say. As soon as I've met any other squad, this is where things get a bit dicey.
That's a bit of a shame, though, because obviously the point where control and performance is most critical is when you're engaging in the core gameplay loop itself that requires a lot of precise, fine, and low latency control. And when that happens, when you engage with enemies, that is a big shame, actually, because this is, I would say, if it was maybe like drops to like 29 or 28 FPS, just like briefly when like a bit of alpha hits the screen, I would say that's not too horrible for the Switch. But watching this kind of play out here, where I'm seeing you engage with these squads here, and it's like a constant 25 almost at times. I don't know if that's exactly in my completely playable category, especially for a game like this, where you're going to be, unless you turn it off, engaging in crossplay with people that will be, having 60 FPS without very many dips at all. That is a pretty big, there's a pretty big competitive advantage for people not playing on the Switch.
This raises an interesting point, and I think we've discussed this before,
Yes.
Alex, that we know that the frame rate drops on Switch when you're about to encounter a squad, but there are points where I've also noticed you can just be running through terrain, like on this Olympus stage here, and suddenly it'll just drop to the mid-20s, and there's no obvious reason why. This area ran fine before, and this is a theory, but maybe a fair one, that perhaps around the corner there are some enemies, and that frame rate drop is a dead giveaway that you're about to encounter someone.
I honestly would not doubt that too much based upon the footage that we've been looking over here, because every single time it seems like you just even get within visual range of a squad, even before the combat heats up and grenades are thrown and full res alpha effects hit the screen, like right here, you're just looking at them almost. What if we had our real-time FPS tools playing and we looked every single time we dropped frame rate? Would we essentially be cheating because we would know where the enemies are based upon when frames drop? I have no idea. But
yeah, just do a full 360-degree turn and look around, see where the frame rate is, and run in that direction.
That'd be amazing if that ended up bearing out. But it is, I do think this is a bit of a shame because, you want a game to be playable, and I don't honestly consider mid-20s FPS in moments of combat very playable for a first-person shooter at all. That's just my opinion, but I think a lot of people feel that way too, so this is kind of a shame.
On top of that, though, it's not a massive issue. In this particular case, there is the uneven frame pacing when you're at 30, but it's actually a very irregular site. So, and also portable play. I'm not going to labor too much on this, but it is actually pretty much in the same region as docked play in the overall range of frame rate, and adjusting the resolution to a lower bounds does help, but it's a very taxing game CPU wise, especially with all the networking going on. So it has similar-ish drops. 20 to 30 FPS is kind of the range there.
I almost feel like when we do talk about this, if we were to get down to a verdict here, you can obviously say what you wish to say there, Tom, but for me, in a game like this, I do want like steady performance, even if it means, on the Switch, which we already have great understandings that it's a compromised experience in general, but you do want some more steady performance. I do wonder at the same time if not every Switch port needs to be made sometimes. Not to say this is not worth it for people who enjoy playing this game, but there are just like bottom lines of performance due to things that you can't change too much, like CPU performance or maybe like bandwidth performance, which is also a bit lower here on the Switch. If the game's just like base gameplay requirements do, in this already compromised state, drop the performance so heavily, even though there's not much going on at times, does make you wonder a little bit if it is actually very possible to port the game in a way that is worth it.
Yeah, I think some understanding of how hard Panic Button worked to make this happen, it has to be respected. I mean, if you were in this position of porting the game that this is, from the outset, it is a challenge, and they've masterfully handled with Switch's limits. Titles like Doom Eternal and even Rocket League runs really well on there. But it does seem like there are some games which are an easier fit, let's say, for the the Switch's capabilities, and this is why I say this is one of the most taxing games I've seen on Switch. There's nothing else quite like it. Fortnite obviously is the closest example, but this is kind of another level in terms of how taxing it is. Yeah, I've got to say it's a real technical marvel. It kind of experiments, I guess, and I suppose at a push it is playable. You can have I actually won a game on the Switch playing this way. Perhaps the best route is to disable that crossplay. You're limiting your player base to match up with, but it's got to be a lot more fair when it comes to the online competitive element. I am impressed that it exists at all, but yeah, just go in expecting, and it's free of course, but go in expecting heavy compromises with this one.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay, so I think that'll do it for this one. Thanks so much for joining me, Alex.
Of course there, Tom.
Wrap up here, the usual stuff. If you like this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell. I know it's an extra step, but it'll mean you get notifications as any new video lands. And of course, to get high quality versions of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. And to get in touch with myself, Alex, or the rest of the team, we're of course on Twitter. But from Alex and myself, thanks for watching.